Thank you for joining us and being part of this session. I'm really excited about this subject matter and really pleased that so many of you have made the time to be part of this with us. My name is Azar Janjua. I head up the Communitech Outpost program, which is an employer of record service helping Canadian companies hire outside of Canada. But today I want to introduce you to our fine panelists. Natalie Giroux is a IP strategy expert with extensive hands-on experience in strategic intellectual property management. Natalie can lean in as a trusted strategic advisor because she's been where many of her clients are, and her goal at Stratford Intellectual Property is to provide access to her team's expertise and the lessons learned from years in the industry. Natalie has helped innovators and companies with portfolios of all sizes and finds a strategy that not only maximizes their investments in intellectual property, but uses it to meet their end business goals. Neil Henderson is a lawyer, patent, and trademark agent. He helps clients of all sizes with IP strategy, from garage to multinational. He makes sure that clients get the best IP protection possible for their stage of growth. Neil has more years of experience than he wants to mention, but he can handle any IP issues that pop up. So we're so pleased and thankful to both Natalie and Neil for joining us in this session. I think what we'll start is with a level set. So if I could ask everyone to maybe go on to menti.com, I'll share my screen. And we just have a few anonymous questions that we'd like to ask just to get a level set of the audience. All right, can you see my screen?
Yes, that looks good, Azar.
Perfect. So yeah, if you guys don't mind going on menti.com, you putting in that code, and there's just a simple yes or no question about whether you and your organization have an IP strategy today.
Looking like everyone's come to the right place.
Absolutely. All right, I'll move on to the next question. Have you built intellectual property into your contracts? We'll go to the next one. Does your organization use open source software?
Definite trend going on that one. I think the better question would be, who doesn't?
And then final question, do you manage your trade secrets? Sorry, I have to try to unshare my screen now. Here we go. Thank you so much for that feedback. That really helps us a lot. So let me just start with the first question to Natalie. Again, thanks for joining. Really quickly, I wanted to get an idea of how did you end up in this field? How did you become an IP expert, and why?
It was really by accident. So Newbridge Networks, we got sued by Lucent for infringement of 5 patents. 2 of them were in my area of expertise, so I got involved. Ended up managing the lawsuit, which lasted 5 years. Ended up in a jury trial in Delaware for 5 weeks. And during that time, I learned a great deal about what is an IP strategy, all the mistakes that Newbridge had done from starting all the way where they were. And I decided after that to help small and medium companies build from the start the right strategies and the right mindset to avoid getting in trouble like Newbridge. So I've been doing this for 25 years now.
Fantastic. And Neil, when you first day of law school, do you want to be a patent lawyer?
No, that's kind of the funny thing is I was working as an engineer and thought, oh, this law stuff looks interesting. I'll date myself, but it was because of a TV show called LA Law. But so I ended off trundling off to law school, and I hadn't even heard of IP when I got to law school. But as soon as I got there, everyone said, oh, you're an engineer, you'll be an IP lawyer. And that just opened all the doors from there. And so got through law school, got out, and I've actually done a pretty broad base of work since getting out of law school, including some work in a small, what I call a small multinational. So a company that had 20 people in 7 countries. So I like your idea about outposts. I really like that side. But since doing that small company, I've gotten way more focused on the IP side. So I've been in law firms doing IP work for 20 plus years now.
Fantastic. Natalie, I'll kind of give you the first hard question. So, you know, if I'm an entrepreneur and I've got an idea, right? And I really think this is going to be a great idea. I haven't started to build it yet, but I want to start to bring this idea to fruition, right? Whether it could be a hardware, a software, some sort of technology, some sort of widget. What is the best steps to protect myself before prototyping that particular idea or invention? Where would you start?
So first is make sure you only talk about it under NDA. So not sharing it with anyone unless you're under NDAs. Also, if it's appropriate, you might consider patent protection through provisional patents that are well prepared, and also maybe trade secrets. And if you're working with other people, I would also recommend to make sure you have proper IP assignments agreements between all the people that are involved with the product right from the get-go.
Neil, could you expand on that? Like, what would a young company be looking for in either an NDA or the thought process of a provisional patent?
Yeah, and I was just going to mention the whole idea of IP in your contracts. IP, you want it to have it in every contract. Anybody who has any contact with your company should be under a contract, and that contract should include some IP provisions. Those are all negotiable, but ideally they should all say company owns the IP, anything that comes forward. That is sort of the starting point, because before you even think about doing a provisional patent, you're going to be talking to some people. You may have contractors, things like that. So it's best to have those all in place. And then, yeah, like every startup, I always say every startup has a name and generally an idea. So I'd throw in trademarks is something to think about with regard to your name. And then patents. And patents does have this thing called the provisional patent application that lets you get started a little bit more cheaply and a little bit faster. And so that can get going right away. A lot of people think that they need a prototype or they need to have something that works in their hands before they can do that. You can actually do that much earlier in the process when you've got something conceptualized, you've got a good idea of how it's going to work. You may not have made the prototype, but you can still go ahead.
Natalie, you had great feedback on trade secrets. Could you help us expand on what companies should know about what a trade secret is and what they can do with that knowledge in the early stages?
Yes, so trade secrets are very, very valuable type of IP, but they're unfortunately misunderstood. And we saw that in the Menti answers there. If your invention and your innovation is somewhere where people can't access them legally, so any kind of software on the cloud that's secured, this can be a good option for a trade secret. And this allows you to protect your invention without it ever being published. Because when you file for patent protection in 18 months, it's published and available for the entire world to see and use, except for the countries you've been able to afford to protect. So being able to identify what can be reverse engineered and what cannot be is really essential to deciding between trade secrets and patents. And that should be really important in your IP strategy. The other thing is that just saying, okay, well, then we'll keep it as a trade secret, you have to take some steps. Cybersecurity, HR, and awareness, but also making sure you can catalog the different trade secrets you have so that investors and acquirers sees value in them.
How would you draft those trade secrets? Like, what's the best way to compartmentalize that?
So it could be as simple, a catalog of trade secret can be as simple as an Excel spreadsheet with titles, very high level. You don't document the secrets themselves, but you can say, I have an algorithm to process data, to extract a mean of something, like just a very high level, and then metadata about inventors, like who has access to those trade secrets, who's working on them, who has access to that piece of code, and other metadata like that, such that if an employee leaves, you can put them on notice that, yeah, you've been working on all these trade secrets, and these are considered trade secrets to our company that you cannot reuse.
Thank you. Neil, one of our participants has a question about your earlier comment. Do you recommend asking investors or potential investors to sign an NDA before you start sharing your idea with them?
Yes. Ideally, that's what you want to do. And that lets you protect those trade secrets that Natalie was just discussing, right? You can talk to investors at a high level without getting into the details of how your new development functions to get them interested. But at some point, you'd like to get them on the hook to sign an agreement. There's probably some out there that won't sign it, and then it's a trade secret can be in place just by saying, hey, this is confidential. It becomes your word against their word. You don't have it in writing. It's a little bit tougher, but you can still take those steps. And then lastly, if they just say, no, I don't want anything to be confidential, it's how much money do they have versus how much risk is there that you're going to run off with your idea. And you've just got to try and balance it.
And of course, when you're talking to investors or other companies and you're presenting a deck and talking about the growth and the financial part, aside from the technology, you want to mark that as confidential on every page, right?
Ideally, yeah.
Now let me come back to you. What's the difference between well, actually, let's go to this. Should a company invest in a patent application before or after prototyping and initial testing, and why?
So definitely as soon as possible, because the priority date of which when you file your application is really critical in establishing what prior art will be applied when you prosecute your application. So the earliest you can file your application, the better, but you need to have enough sufficient disclosure in order to have a priority date. So if you know your algorithm, you know all the detail, you know it's going to work, then it's a good time to file. Sometimes you can do provisional applications and then add to them until you're ready to file the conventional application. But the problem is anything you add, you've actually lost your date from anything you add bears the date of the new filing. So it becomes really complicated. But I would say as soon as possible once you have the details.
Can you explain why that priority date or filing date is so important?
So when a patent is filed, there's an examiner at the patent office that will look at existing art, so we call that prior art, that could be the same as what you filed. So, they could say that it's not inventive or it's obvious to someone skilled in the art to combine different pieces of art that would invalidate what you're trying to protect. So the later you are, the more chance there's people that will have filed something similar to what you're doing. And in fact, even people who've heard about your idea may have had a chance to file it before yourself. So that's also important. The other thing is, in many countries except Canada and US, you cannot do a public disclosure before filing. So you have to be very, very careful about doing any kind of public disclosure without NDAs before you file for your patent protection. Otherwise, you won't be able to even file a patent later.
Neil, can you file a provisional patent in Canada?
There is the idea of a provisional patent in Canada. There is a loose system for it, but at least in my practice, we tend to file in the US because they have a very robust system for filing provisional applications. And in fact, the cost can be slightly cheaper to start off in the US than it is in Canada. So that's the route that we tend to take. I do know of some people that do more of a Canadian type of provisional, but I find that the US tends to work better.
And the US, well, sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say, and you know, investors like when you have an application on file in the US, just because it's that much bigger of a market, it doesn't hurt to start down there and get that US aspect of it ironed out.
The US provisional lasts for 1 year until you file the conventional the next year. Is that right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, the provisional is kind of like a placeholder or a stake in the sand saying, you know, as of this date, I have it. And that buys you a year before you need to file a formal application that fleshes it out and provides claims and puts you into the mainstream of the patenting process.
And then how does that US provisional application affect your Canadian priority date?
Well, the US provisional establishes what's called the priority date. So, and there are international conventions that say, once I've established that first priority date, I've got those 12 months. And at the end of the 12 months, you can file in almost every country in the world and still get backdated to that initial filing priority date. So just one filing gets you 12 months before you need to decide and make strategies for what other countries you want to try and seek protection in. But the start date is that filing date, and that becomes the important one.
Thank you. Natalie, I'll go back to you. So obviously, if a company's collecting trade secrets, they do that in-house. But if they're considering a provisional application, how much should they budget for that?
For a provisional.
Yeah.
So it really depends on the complexity and how much material you have ready to provide to the agent to do the drafting. So it can very much vary from 3,000 to 8,000 to 10,000. It also depends on the firm you're working with. I've heard 15,000 even for provisional. So it really varies on, and some firms will charge by the time versus a fixed fee. So it's really difficult to say. The one advice I would give is that you want to make sure that your provisional is conventional ready. Because one of the biggest mistake I see is people who do quick provisional where they put just a few things. I've seen people filing PowerPoints as provisional, thinking that they're not covered for a year. But when it's time to actually draft the application, there's so much material that gets added that the priority date is effectively lost. So you have this false sense of security for a year, and in fact, you didn't protect anything during that year. So,
Neil, actually, maybe follow up on that. Can you give examples of mistakes that entrepreneurs sometimes have when they're providing their applications or filing patents?
Yeah, it's a long list, but I'll give a few. I always say with a provisional, if you're in a startup mode, you can do the quick and dirty. You can do it at the low range, you know, $3,000 kind of will get you in the door. But like Natalie said, that's risky. That's really quick and dirty. The ideal provisional is somewhere between what a provisional would cost at the low end and a full convention formal filing at the other end. So it could be up to that 10,000, 12,000 range pretty easy. And one of the things that people do as a mistake is they really try and lowball it. They try and go cheap up front. And that puts it at risk in that if you don't have enough material in there, you're going to have trouble maintaining that date if someone slides in and has something filed between your priority date and the date you do your convention filing, formal filing. So I always do recommend that you put more money in up front if you possibly can, There's some situations where you can't, and that's understandable, but the more you can, don't go too cheap. Start off with something more robust and get it in there. The other thing that I see a little bit too much, especially lately, is, mine's faster, mine's bigger, mine's smaller, mine's, nicer, or you're basically submitting marketing material. What we need from a patent perspective is actually technical material, not so much that it's faster, but why is it faster? What's the technical difference that causes it to be faster? Because just faster isn't good enough. Every time you get a new processor, it gets faster. Tell me why you're actually able to do that. So functionality, the technical side is pretty important to get in there. The other thing I think I see a lot is, especially with software is best described by flowcharts. We don't need the actual code. We like algorithms, and algorithms are often best shown in a flowchart. So quite often when we get a software application, it's just this general series of steps without a good flow charting process as to how it works. So the more, and I generalize that to the more drawings that we can get in, whether it's flow charts or drawings of a new mechanical feature, the more drawings we have, the better. And I always say, the old saying, a picture says 1,000 words. If we've got some good drawings in there, we can later add in some text that explains the drawings. But if you don't have good drawings, you're kind of stuck with the text, which may not be as much as you'd like at the end of the day.
Thank you. Natalie, we saw in the Mentimeter poll that the majority of participants in this call are using open source software. Do you have any recommendations as to how, and I'll ask both of you that one at a time, but any recommendations on what they should do with that open source and how they should collect it and maintain that registry?
So definitely there needs to be a policy on the use of open source software. People can just add it, whatever software they find on the internet without cataloging what kind of licenses are being used by the software. So because each open source software has different copyright licenses that need to be obeyed to, and you need to make sure that you're following the rules. GPL and Ubuntu, they all have different rules. So you have to know what's in your software and whether the rules are being complied to. So again, potentially another spreadsheet to start, but there also exists some software that will scan through all your software and extract the open source and list all the licenses. And that's an ongoing process. And when you hire new employees, they have to know, do you allow them to use open source or not? Because I saw some people that do not use open source. And I used to be working with a venture capital firm a few years ago, and we were just about to sell a company to Siemens. Everything was signed, everything was ready. They were in the final step of due diligence, and they found some open source software, and they put a stop to the transaction until the company rewrote every line of open source into their own software. So it's really critical to know what's in there and to have a contingency plan to replace it if needed. So,
Neil, any follow-up?
Yeah, I was just going to say pretty much exactly the same thing as Natalie. I've seen deals where, in fact, the VC comes in and uses that tracking software, the one that can tell if there's open source in there. If they discover open source, you've got to have a very good explanation for the way that you've integrated it, the way that it's being used in order to let that deal go ahead. And I think most people are getting much more aware of this, and hopefully all of those that are using open source. It is possible to use open source, but you have to do it in a way that matches with those particular agreements that Natalie was discussing. All the license agreements are different, and you've got to be very, very careful because of the issue of if you don't use it correctly, your software could be open sourced. It could be dragged into the open source system. And more open source licenses and agreements are also dragging along any patents. So you're not just losing your copyright potentially, but you're also losing potentially patents that you may have filed on your own software might be dragged into the open source world at the same time. So I think the number one thing is just be very careful when using it. And as Natalie said, make sure all the employees, all the people that you're working with, outside consultants, anybody, tell them they've got to let you know if they're considering using it and how they're going to work it in, and make sure that fits in with your overall strategy.
Yeah, on that, Natalie, how who's going to come looking for it? So if you're building something and you're using all this open source, right? First, who in the organization should collect that information? Where should they find it? And who's going to come asking for it in the future?
So it depends on the organization and who's accountable for intellectual property. Sometimes it's the CTO, or in this case, often product management would get involved, or the VP of R&D. And I would recommend that it's integrated into the product development process. So at each gate review, you can ask your software designers, did you use open source? If so, what have you used? And then you collect that, like I said, even in a spreadsheet, and then quarterly, you review if you've actually re-uploaded what you had to for that piece of software, and if you're protected with the license. It's actually not trivial. At the end, it might be easier to write your own software, but I understand that to get your prototype read out there, or your MVP, sometimes it's better to use all sorts of pieces of open source, but it's a big red flag in IP. So.
Neil, we've got a question from the field here. Are coding libraries like Java with standard functions, would that be considered open source? Or is it the same as open source?
Well, again, it depends on the license for that library. So it could be licensed under an open source license, or it could be licensed under a paid type of license. So again, you've got to look at the documents that come with that library. The way I've sort of always explained it is, if you're not altering the open source, you're just using the API that's already built in there, you're just making function calls into the open source, then generally that shouldn't be an issue. I mean, there may be some licenses that try and pull you in anyways, but generally speaking, as long as you keep some distance between your own code and the open source, you should be okay. Again, I'll just reiterate, check the license, but that's been the general approach that's been taken for a number of years now, is just make sure you're not altering that code, you're not touching it other than an authorized API into it.
Yeah, and I could just add really quickly on that too. My last role was IP for a large software company. And I will say that if you're doing a big deal with a telecommunications carrier, a post office, an airline, a bank, they do ask for the open source list for every version of the software that they're going to purchase. That does tend to come up.
Yeah, you'll get asked for that kind of information from investors, sometimes customers that are buying the software. And the other person that might come looking at some point is the open source community itself. Might say, okay, looks like you're using our code, we're going to open source you, we're going to take you out into our community. So there are people that will be monitoring.
All right, Natalie, I think I'll shift gears a little bit. So, the word Google, the word Zoom have become verbs, right? They're company names that have become verbs, right? Skype as well. What do you say to companies about trademarks and how important it is for them to recognize their trademarks and protect those locally or internationally?
So definitely it's important to register the trademark, but most importantly, you want to monitor their use to make sure they don't become a common word, right? Like often we're going to say we're going to use Zoom, but we're on Teams or we're on Skype, right? So Zooming is becoming just teleconferencing. It's like a refrigerator, right? So actively monitoring your mark after you're registering it is really important to make sure that it's used consistently and it's used to represent what you're doing, not what others are doing.
And Neil, where would they start? So what do you think the first steps are? So they've figured out their mark, they've got a brand name or a product name, and now they come to a lawyer and say, okay, I want to protect something. What should they ask you? What should they do?
Yeah, I'll give you the first answer that you should always get is start using a little TM beside your name. A lot of people don't know this, but you can do that without registering, without doing anything. You're just telling the world, hey, I think this is my trademark. So you can put the little TM on right from the get-go. That's a start. And then you can move into the registration process. And the registration process is a bit like the patent process, just faster and cheaper. But you basically start by submitting a registration. There's again a priority system. So you can file in one country and then you've got 6 months instead of 12, in which you can file in other countries and maintain that same filing date. So one of the tricks in trademarks is the first country you file in should be one where you have a real commercial presence. So for most Canadian companies, we start in Canada. That gets you 6 months before you need to file in the US or other countries and build up your portfolio that way. The good thing about trademarks is you don't need to register before you're publicly using. You can be using it without registration. It's usually not a problem. There are countries where just using it doesn't get you any protection. And the big one that everybody has had trouble with is China. In China, if you want protection, you have to register early. So what I say to anybody in Canada is, if the word China flips through your mind slowly with regard to your company, file for your trademark in China at that point. Because as soon as there's any indication that you might be trying to move into the Chinese market, someone will jump on your trademark over there. It's probably not as bad as that, but get it done early. Other countries, you can usually wait until you're ready to expand into that country before you go for registration. But the earlier, the better. Again, it comes down to how much cash is available and how do you want to move it forward. The whole issue of Google becoming a verb and things like that is a really interesting one. And there have been situations where people have actually lost trademarks because of that. Somebody's actually challenged it at a certain point and said it's become generic. Aspirin is one, and I always get it backwards, but I think in Canada, aspirin is still a trademark, whereas in the US, it is not. So you get these weird situations where it can still be present in a country and not in another. You do need to police it, and you do see campaigns every now and again where the last one I think I saw had to do with Pepsi, where people were going to a restaurant and asking for a Pepsi or asking for a Coke, and someone said, is Pepsi okay? Or there was some ad campaign where they were trying to establish that their mark was still very valid. Yeah, it's something that you really only need to worry about when you get pretty big, like a Google or Zoom has become suddenly. So you may see Zoom coming out with some kind of a campaign to remind people that it is a trademark at some point.
Yeah, sorry, anything to follow up?
I just wanted to add that when you start, and putting the TM is great, but you need to do a quick search at least on CIPO and USPTO, and also search for all the domain names that resemble your brand or your mark. So you don't necessarily need to have anyone like an agent to do it. You can do a lot of this yourself, but make sure it's not a super crowded space where a lot of people are using the same mark. And then you wait a year or two, and then you establish your own brand, and then you can't even use it after, because it's really expensive to rebrand if you can't register your mark down the road. Also looking at domain name, and people often miss that. And then they establish a brand only to find that there's some really dark domain name that's doing some really weird stuff with the same name, and it's also too late. So doing a quick search before, I think is highly recommended. And then before you spend money to register the mark, then you do a formal search to make.
Which is what your trademark agent would do after you've already kind of done the due diligence up front.
Yeah.
Yeah, you can do additional searching. That reminds me, the thing I always say is if you can get the .com, you're probably pretty good, because all of the good .coms are gone, everything that people have done. But if you're ending up that you have to get the .ca or the .au.com or some other domain name, then you've got to look a little more closely, because clearly someone else is using your name in some way, shape, or form. And if they're using it with the same general goods and services that you're offering, then you could be in trouble. So yeah, Natalie's point is a very good one. Look at those, do your own searching. If you want to, you can have a trademark agent do the searching, but do a little bit of a clearance search. Make sure that there's not 10 other people there using a very similar name. On that point, in trademarks, it doesn't have to be exactly the same. So if you're spelling yours with a C and they're spelling theirs with a K, that's not going to save you. You'll still be in potential trouble from a trademark perspective. So it's got to be similar names as well, from a phonetic viewpoint, from a spelling viewpoint.
Natalie, can you talk about how trademarks are tied to goods and services?
Right, so that when you file a trademark, you select the different services and goods that you apply your mark to, because someone else could use the exact same mark in a completely different field, as long as they're not conflicting or that they could cause confusion, right? So I'm not a trademark agent expert here, but that's how it works. So they categorize the mark in the different classes, and then it allows people to say that, well, this trademark will not compete with this one because they're in different groups. So it's really important to select a broad set of classes when you file your trademark to cover what you plan to do in the future as well. So
yeah, Neil, if I'm a software company, am I producing a good or a service?
Both, generally, nowadays anyways. And in fact, software companies are now becoming service companies, SaaS, software as a service. What we usually try and do is cover both the class that has downloadable software. So if you've got an app that people are using, that is a good, that's a product that they can actually put on their phone or their mobile or whatever. And then, if everything's in the web, it's all software as a service, then we also try and cover that service side where you're providing services through the internet. So most software companies, it ends up, we try and cover both types of classes. And even nowadays, we're getting into covering an additional class that includes business related services, consulting services, because there's often a component of that in the software provision nowadays.
Thank you for that. Okay, now there's a few deep dive questions that we got before the webinar started. And I guess I'll keep it open and see who wants to answer these ones. So the first one's about learning algorithms. Can algorithms be registered as intellectual property, and under what format?
Natalie, do you want me to do?
I can start if you want. So depending where the learning algorithm is, it can be protected as a trade secret, or it will need to be protected as a trademark. So if the learning algorithm is software that's in your phone, that can be reverse engineered and extracted from the phone and figured out, then it needs to be protected by a patent. If the learning algorithm is on the cloud and only data goes into the cloud and out of the cloud, but all the processing is done on a secured cloud server, then trade secrets is a great way to protect the algorithm. And if you're looking at patents, there's lots of people that say that software patents are not valid, but there's great ways to write good software patents to make them valid. So there is definitely a way of doing that. But again, it depends on whether your algorithm can be reverse engineered or not legally.
Yeah, and I'll just add to that. I agree, and I've actually done that with people where they kind of have a black box that does the processing, and they take data in and spit data out. So we've actually been able to file a patent application that covers everything around that, but leave the black box as a trade secret. So that's a kind of a hybrid approach where you're getting both a patent filing and a trade secret maintained. The one thing that I always say about trade secrets is they protect the actual information that you have as a trade secret. But if someone sees your process, sees the data in and sees the data out, they might be able to figure out what's going on in that black box. Again, it's sort of a reverse engineering type of thing. And so I'm often a little more leery of trade secret, because if someone independently develops that technology on their own, your trade secret doesn't allow you to stop them unless you can show that they took the trade secret from you. So there's a connection through an employee or something like that. So trade secrets are great because they can last forever, but you've got to make sure that it's not something that somebody else could work out, some other smart person in the industry, because if they work it out, then you've got a competitor that you can't control in the same way that you might be able to control them if you have a patent application on the same material. Now, obviously, I'm a patent person, so I'm more pro-patent, but I do understand the trade secret side and why it can be important. It's just I like people to think about that. How easy would it be for someone else who looks at this market and says, I want a piece of it, just to independently develop?
Now, the collection of data, of course, is a hot topic, and it has been for several years. If a company has a unique way of processing that data, of either collecting it and holding it, and if they have a unique way of doing that, is there a way to file an application for that?
It's more or less the same as what we were just discussing.
Yeah.
There are patents that have been allowed for data structures, like unique kind of data structures. Again, if you're not letting it out into the public, it could be a trade secret in the way that you use it or control it internally. So it could go either the trade secret route or the patent route in a very similar way. And again, I'll sort of emphasize what Natalie was saying is, in the world of software, there are people that believe software should be free and open source. And that's perfectly fine, but it limits your ability to protect your marketplace. And patents on software have had their ups and downs over the years. Right now, they're in a bit of a down phase, but they will be coming back and there's signs that they'll start coming back right now and be a little bit easier to get. And I always say to a software company, if you want to go open source, you've got to go whole hog open source. But if you want to have some protection over your proprietary software, it's best to get some patent applications at least filed. Because if you're not doing it, your competitors will be. There'll be someone in your industry. And if you don't have some filings, then you become a bit of a sitting duck, in that someone who has a patent on the technology can come and potentially shut you down. So again, pro-patent kind of a viewpoint, but it's best to know what your competitors will be doing and try and keep up with them.
Another open question for you is, can you explain how holding a patent or a trademark in any region is a negative right? Or
yeah, I'm trying to think what that means.
no, in terms of how do you, okay, so enforcement, right? So how, so can you enforce something if you haven't filed it, right? And then how would you enforce? I guess that's the question.
That you have not filed.
Yeah. So let's say I've got a trade secret, or I've got, I put the TM on my trademark, right? And now someone is found to have infringed. I think one of my people on the internet has found something that looks and feels like what I'm doing, right? How do you enforce that?
So I think if you haven't filed, it's really hard to enforce it. Even if your patent isn't issued, it's really hard to enforce it. if your patent's still pending, you can amend your claim to strengthen them to be more like what they're doing, so that when it issues, you're ready to do something. But if you don't have formal protection, same for trademarks, it's really hard. In the case of trademark, though, the TM gives you basically common law protection, where you can tell someone, look, I've been using TM for the last 3 years. I intend to register this trademark, therefore I should own it. But registration is definitely the best way there.
Yeah, and it varies country by country, and even some countries where they say you need to register, there are some historical rights if you've been using it a lot. So you need to look at each individual circumstance. The other reason I've heard that term, like a negative right, that is important for people to know is that, especially patent rights, they give you the right to prevent people from doing things. They don't give you the right to do something. So if I have a patent on a technology, that doesn't necessarily allow me to make that technology. It allows me to prevent others from using whatever my improvement or change in it is. But my technology might incorporate things that other people have patented. So even if I get my patent, if it incorporates other things that were previously patented by others, my patent doesn't help me so much against those people. I can still be sued for patent infringement. So that's how I think of patents as a negative right, in that it allows you to exclude, but doesn't allow you permission to move ahead.
And it's important to remember that that's per country as well. So if I file a patent in the US and I don't have funds to cover any other country because it gets really expensive, then when my patent is published, anyone outside of the US can take the algorithm I've disclosed and manufacture, sell in all these other countries except for US. So I don't know if that would be called a negative right, but you're actually disclosing your technology for others to use in their other countries that you can't cover. So that is definitely another consideration when you decide to go with a trade secret, because that never gets disclosed. But there's really pro and cons for both, but that's something to think about.
And then if a company's gone through the steps at the early stages to file a few provisionals or file, even get to a conventional applications and has been given the right to some patents, and then they see an infringement somewhere, how do they go forward on enforcement? What can they do then? And how much do they budget for that?
Get a good law firm. And depending on which country you're in, if it's a clear infringement and the person who's infringing or the entity has lots of money, sometimes you can get it done on contingency. Otherwise, you need a big bank account to be able to pay the legal fees, unfortunately. The process actually usually starts, you've got to determine your strategy. If you see an infringer, is your strategy going to be, I want to stop them and get them out of the marketplace? Or is your strategy, I want them to pay me lots of money? And that's sort of a starting point. And then you move usually to a letter where you say, hey, we want you to stop, or we want you to pay us some money for every one you make. You can sort of structure it depending on your strategy. And then once the letters go back and forth a little bit, once you realize it's not going anywhere, then your choice is, do I go to the courts? Do I go and take them into the court system? And that's a long drawn out process, and you can settle at any point along the process. But you start committing more and more money unless you can get a contingency basis. Contingencies mostly work in the US. There aren't a lot of other countries where they work well. But there are people in the US that will support a litigation if the infringer has some money and it looks like a good target.
All right, and then
That's a really rough overview. It's way more detailed than that.
And if I may add, there's a lot of people that think, oh, these people infringe my patent, but they're looking at the whole specification of the patent. But sometimes is very high level, has very high level descriptions of your invention, right? But at the end of the day, you can only infringe the claims of the patent, which are more the legalese that are at the end of the patent. And those get narrow and narrow as the prosecution goes before the patent issues. So this is where people have to just not come to the conclusion that someone infringes your patent. You have to get legal advice on saying, well, are my claims infringed? And that you have to have all the elements in the claim. So there's quite a bit of a difference there. So
Interesting. All right, so we've got about 5 minutes left. So I just want to kind of do a last call of the audience. If there are any additional questions, I'll wind down with the couple that I have here. But if there are any more, just please go ahead and put those into the Q&A. Last couple of questions I have so far are, we earlier talked about provisional patents. Do you recommend filing those in both the US and Canada at a minimum if you're a Canadian company?
I think as I said before, filing in the US is sufficient. That's the approach that we take, where we file in the US, get that date, and that date buys you 12 months before you need to file in Canada, UK. There is an international filing system that lets you defer costs even more. So there's lots of strategies for deferring costs, but there's no real benefit to filing in both US and Canada upfront, unless you want to expedite things for some reason, like in a potential infringer or something like that.
but there's also a benefit to file a conventional application right off the bat if you have all the information, because if you can get the prosecution done in the US fast enough, there's a lot of programs called the Patent Prosecution Highway, where when it's time to make your decision for foreign filings after 12 months, you already know if you have a valuable patent, you know what the claim breadth will be, so you know how much you want to invest in all these other countries. So going conventional first and trying to expedite the US examination has a lot of value as opposed to the provisional filing.
Then you've had that application examined, scrutinized, you kind of focused it, and then you can use that for then additional countries?
Yeah, you go to Canada and you say, here's my allowed US application, and they're going to go, well, I'll allow it in Canada. You can save thousands and thousands in prosecution using that process. So it's working.
Yeah. The timing is such that it doesn't help you on the filing generally, but it does help you on the prosecution. So you still need to know, you still need to file in Canada before you'll get your results from the US, but it does help you on prosecution costs. And we typically do that on our filings as well.
Where's the best way for companies to get language like generic text or confidentiality language or NDA type language that would be enforceable as they build their prototypes and build their widgets?
For an NDA, they are like, there's hundreds out there on the internet. If you don't want to spend money on a lawyer, a lot of lawyers will give you their sort of boilerplate one for free. But just, find a company that you respect and you think will have a good one, and find one of theirs on the internet and steal it. Sorry, I'm advocating copyright infringement right now, but what you can do is you can take some sort of boilerplate language, modify it to make it your own. And the fact is that the wording becomes very similar among all of them. So if you find one that's got a reasonable level of respect for that company, you can usually do okay by taking that and modifying it to fit your needs. Most lawyers, they might give you their own boilerplate, or it's a low cost review to put something together for you on that front.
Natalie, any follow-up on that?
Sorry, I agree with that. So.
Okay, last question. So earlier on, we had talked about flow charts, which are important to technology companies. I think, Michael, I'm not sure what you mean by flow charts. I assume you're meaning the collection of source code or trade secret knowledge. Is that correct?
It's what I was mentioning, that it's nice to have software described by means of flow charts. I think that's what
So the question is, who should be assigned to develop that? Who typically develops those charts in-house?
It could be the software developer. Like it's more or less an algorithm, but it's just shown in an illustrated format, step 1, step 2, step 3, step 4. So, you know, a programmer could be doing that during the development cycle. Or I think Natalie mentioned, you know, as you've got your product development milestones, include in there what we sometimes call a patent mining session, where you might say, okay, what's new? What are we doing that's different? What have we struggled with technically and overcome? And the person that identifies that could be the one putting together those flowcharts saying, you know, here's our technical process for how the software works. It's basically a high-level algorithm just abstracted into a flowchart format.
Wonderful.
And that's why considering giving incentives to inventors to participate to that activity can help. So either in time, money, or some kind of you know, a gift to those people who are participating over and above their job, that helps a lot. So depending on the culture of the company, that can be something that helps getting these disclosures done.
Absolutely. All right. Well, it's 3 o'clock.
Sorry, I was going to say there's a funny story. A very large technology company where a friend of mine runs their patent program. He said they got more bang for their buck by putting balloons on the cubicle of the inventor on the day the patent was issued than they did by the $500 honorarium that they gave. So it doesn't always have to be money. It can just be some other fanfare.
Yeah, I've seen sort of a patent wall that comes up in certain companies.
Yeah.
Great. All right, well, it's 3 o'clock. Natalie, Neil, thank you so much for your candid answers and for taking all these questions. Thank you to the participants for giving us all these great questions and feedback. We hope you enjoyed the sessions. We got a good understanding of the landscape, and we at Communitech are going to do more to try to help you navigate the IP landscape with our partners. And we can continue the conversations on how we can harness that knowledge base for you. We encourage you to continue to come to our Ask Me Anythings that we have every week. And with that, I'll kind of leave that. Christina, do you have any follow-up comments to finish up?
Oh, just once again, thank you to Natalie and Neil for joining us. And I hope everyone has a great week. Stay safe, stay well, and we'll see you next time. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks for your attention.
Thank you.